Excuse me, everyone. Okay, there we go. We're recording now. Michael Shuman is an economist, attorney, author, and entrepreneur, and a leading visionary on community economics. He's director of local economy programs for Neighborhood Associates Corporation and an adjunct professor at Bard Business School in New York City. He's also a senior researcher for Council Fire and Local Analytics, where he performed economic development analyses for states, local governments, and businesses around North America. He's credited at being one of the architects of the 2012 Jobs Act and dozens of state laws overhauling securities regulation and crowdfunding. He's authored, co-authored, or edited 10 books. His three most recent books are Put Your Money Where Your Life Is, How to Invest Locally Using Solo 401ks and Self-Directed IRAs, and The Local Economy Solution, How Innovative Self-Financing Pollinator Enterprises Can Grow Jobs and Prosperity and Local Dollars, Local Cents. How to Shift Your Money from Wall Street to Main Street. Sorry about that. Okay. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I will share my screen here. And hopefully we will be able to pull up the first slide. So normally when I have an opportunity to speak with a group in person, one of the first questions that I ask people is, by show of hands, how many of you have all of the money you need for all of the businesses and other project ideas you're working on? And maybe there's one or two stray hands that come up, but for the most part, all of us realize, we admit, we need more money, more capital to do the things we want to do. And that's where the issue of local investing comes in. And I believe that local investing is a key for community prosperity, economic justice, environmental protection, and climate action. One starting place for talking about this is really to acknowledge the importance of local businesses. And I feel like, particularly in this coronavirus moment, when we stand at the precipice of losing perhaps millions of locally owned businesses, we need to appreciate and figure out how to resuscitate them as soon as humanly possible. This was a study done in British Columbia in 2013, comparing the impact of a dollar spent in an independent restaurant and retailer versus a chain restaurant and retailer. And what it shows is that for every dollar that is spent in the independent restaurant and retailer, close to 50 cents goes back and is respent in British Columbia. Whereas if you look at the chain restaurant and retailer, it's about 17, 18 cents on the dollar. So roughly speaking, every time a British Columbian resident mindfully spends a dollar on a locally owned restaurant or retailer, the province enjoys 2.5 times the job effects, 2.5 times the income and wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections, 2.5 times the charitable contributions. We are not talking about small degrees of difference. And in point of fact, there have been about 24 of these studies done in the last 20 years, and every single one of them shows that when you compare two businesses or two industries, one locally owned, one not, the locally owned business or industry generates 2 to 4 times the jobs and economic development impact of the non-local business or industry. And there's not a single study that's shown otherwise. But you don't have to take my word for it. This is from the Harvard Business Review of the summer of 2010. It's a regression analysis of communities across North America. And what it shows is that in those communities with the highest density of locally owned business, there is the highest per capita job growth rate. But not just that, this study from the Federal Reserve of Atlanta, also in 2013, shows that when you look at counties across the United States, in those counties with the highest density of locally owned business, there is the highest per capita income growth rate. So in other words, if you want to reduce poverty, increase economic justice, having a healthy array, a diversity of locally owned businesses is essential for doing so. We also know that locally owned businesses are critical for sustainability, for trying to achieve some form of environmental self-reliance with your resources. Now, part of the reason for this is that locally owned businesses give you the wealth to have good environmental policies to clean up old messes. But we also know that a diversified local economy, like a more self-reliant food economy, doesn't need to import goods from halfway around the world. And that tends to reduce the carbon footprint, which is also good for climate. Another interesting feature of locally owned businesses is that the owner is in the community. And there's a really interesting study that was done a while back by the US EPA comparing locally owned smokestack businesses with absentee-owned smokestack businesses. And the locally owned smokestack businesses have about 1/10 the pollution. Now, the only real explanation for that, as far as I can see, is shame. That when you, in a locally owned situation, when you bump into the owner in your church or grocery store or school, you tend to share with them what you think of the pollution coming out of the plant. Whereas if it's an absentee-owned plant, none of that dynamic can ever take place. The last feature about locally owned businesses and sustainability is this. There is a remarkable global network of cities that share cutting-edge business ideas and policies. And everything that you do in the greater St. Louis area to make yourself more energy self-reliant, or to improve transportation, or to have a more self-reliant local food system. Every innovation that you share with communities around the world helps to move everyone in a direction of greater self-reliance. And that leads me to kind of a new definition of sustainability. Some of you may recognize this woman. This is Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was once the Prime Minister of Norway. And she wrote a pretty important study about 25 years ago that defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the current generation without in any way shortchanging the ability to meet the needs of a future generation. And my argument is that that was a great definition, but it was missing the concept of place. And if we put place in, I would redefine it as sustainability comes when a community meets its own needs, present and future, without compromising the ability of other communities to meet their needs, present and future. So it sort of underscores the need for self-reliance, that local businesses having a diversity and a lot of success with local businesses is key for local self-reliance. And local self-reliance is also pretty important for resilience. And I think that's one of the great lessons that's coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, that those communities that had a higher degree of self-reliance, say in their food system or their energy system, were able to weather this storm we've been through a lot better than communities that were massively dependent on imports because they produce only one or two things. I want to sort of give you a sense of what real local economic development looks like through the saga of a delicatessen called Zingermans in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Zingermans was set up a long time ago, and its first 10 years they were very successful, but they had a dilemma. Should they should they expand into a chain around the United States? They needed to grow the business in order to hold on to their best managers. And they decided against it for two reasons. Number one, they really cared about quality control. And number two, the last thing they wanted to do was fly around the country and, as they said, visit second-rate versions of themselves. They liked hanging out in the store and kibitzing with their neighbors. But what Zingermans decided is that rather than growing broad across the United States, they would grow deep. So they looked systematically at things coming into the deli and things coming out of the deli, and they were able to grow new businesses. So, for example, they serve sandwiches on bread, so they created a bakehouse. They serve coffee. They created a coffee roasting company. They serve ice cream and cheese. They created a creamery. And then looking at things coming out of the deli, they had good food. Why not create a sit-down restaurant called the Roadhouse? They had great cakes. They could create a mail-order cake business. They have good customer service. They could teach other businesses how to do that customer service in a module called Zing Train. So in all, Zingerman's right now is about a dozen independently owned businesses. Each is locally owned. Each has its own board, but they co-license the brand and they meet once a week. All the partners meet once a week as a way of keeping the brand and the quality control high. Now, the thing to notice about this method of economic development is notice how they grew the economy internally. They looked at demands in and around Ann Arbor, and they naturally grew local businesses to meet those demands, confident that some of those businesses, like Zing Train or the coffee cake business, would start to reach other outside markets. And that really is the essence of economic development. You nurture your local businesses, and then you diversify them to meet local demands. What this suggests is that an agenda to support local businesses would focus on 6 Ps: planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policy making. Planning means you identify leaks in your economy, all the places where people are unnecessarily purchasing outside goods and services, and then you grow local businesses to plug those leaks. People. How do you nurture a new generation of entrepreneurs to lead these leak-plugging businesses? Partners. How do we create networks of local businesses that are more effective, more competitive as a team than they are acting alone? Purse. How do you tap savings that people have, whether in banks or in pension funds, and put them to work in your local businesses? Purchasing. How do you spearhead buy local or think local first campaigns? And then there's policy making. How do you reshape the environment so that there aren't what are usually biases against local businesses? Now, I've been on the bully pulpit talking about local businesses for about 25 years. And the one consistent bit of feedback that I get from local businesses, whether it is in here or in Africa or Australia, is that the single biggest obstacle is purse. It is capital. How can they get the capital to start and grow their businesses? Now, here is another thing that I would do with a live audience, everyone in person, that I can't really do right now, but I'll kind of walk you through it. And I ask people 3 questions. The first question is, how many of you have mindfully bought something locally over the last week? And I know that all of our purchasing behavior has been disrupted by COVID, but typically almost all the hands go up. Someone's gone to a farmer's market or a local pharmacy or some other local restaurant, and so they're thinking about local. Second question, how many of you do your banking at a local bank or credit union? And about half the hands go up, And this turns out to be important for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. The last question is, those of you with any pension savings at all, how many of you put at least 1% into locally owned business? And all of the hands go down. And to me, this is quite remarkable, because if we had more time, I would show you a bunch of data that would convince you that typically in any given metro area, 60 to 80% of our economy in jobs and output is in locally owned business. And those businesses are highly competitive. They have good profit rates. And yet, we as investors, we the people who come to webinars like this on climate change, are systematically investing in the global companies that are detached from what we're trying to achieve. We've got to fix this problem. And if we don't fix this problem, we're never going to solve the climate crisis. Now, the reason for this is not because people don't want to invest locally. It's really because there is a history of what are called securities laws, which in a way created a situation that I sometimes call investment apartheid. These laws, enacted in the 1930s, create two classes of investors. If you are a wealthy person, the top 2 or 3% of people by income or wealth, you're allowed to invest in anything, anytime, no questions asked. If you're in the other part of society, like most of us, you're an unaccredited investor, and you can only put a penny into a local business if that business has done $25, $50, $100,000 of legal work, which most local businesses never want to do. Now, if we could change this law, if we could change our habits of investment, if we could move the $56 trillion that we have in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, pension funds, and insurance funds into, and let's just call it the 60% of the economy that is locally owned, take your community, take your population, multiply that by $100,000 per person, and that's the amount of new investment capital that you would have to put into climate-friendly businesses. Now, you don't need perfection to achieve such a massive transfer of capital. So this is a study I did in Metro Cleveland in 2010 with 2 others, and we looked at what would be the impact of a 25% shift toward local food. What we found is that that 25% shift in Northeast Ohio would create 27,000 jobs, paying almost $1 billion and generating about $126 million in new taxes. Now, what would it take in order to achieve a 25% shift toward local food? Well, it would take some significant investment in local food businesses. And we estimated that that investment would be about $750 million. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but it turns out that $750 million is 1% of what Clevelanders have in their bank account, and 1/4% of what Clevelanders have in their pension funds. So in other words, even a very small shift of capital can make an enormous difference in jobs, wages, and a climate mission that many of us share. So I want to talk briefly about what are some examples of local investment opportunities. So I'm gonna talk about 7 of them. So I call them the Magnificent 7. They fought like 700. So number 1, investing in yourself is local investing. Getting yourself out of credit card debt where you're paying 20 to 30% on every dollar per year, and putting that money into yourself to get out of that debt is a huge payoff. And it's much more significant than anything you are likely to achieve with Wall Street. But what's good for the goose is also good for your family and for your neighbors. And local investment should also be seen as a way of pulling your neighbors out of your debt, your kids out of student debt, maybe investing in your home, or if you have a mortgage, you could pay off the mortgage faster, or you could buy energy efficiency systems for your home, or a greenhouse for your home, or renewable energy systems. The point here is that there's a whole lot of things that you can invest in that have great rates of return, that help your community, that keep money circulating in your community and make you and the people around you better off. Number 3, you can invest in your co-op. The Weaver Street Market, which is in Research Triangle, North Carolina, about 10 years ago, decided they were going to build a third store. They needed $1 million. They borrowed it from their 15,000 or so members, paying them 5 to 7% per year for the privilege of using that money, a much better return than people were going to get on Wall Street. Another thing that you can do with your money is you can just put it on deposit in your local bank or credit union while you're figuring out what to do with it. And the reason why local banks and credit unions are important is that the probability of $1 in a local bank or credit union being lent to a locally owned business is 3 times greater than if your dollar goes into Bank of America or Wells Fargo. Number 5, you can invest in your city. Every city generates municipal bonds, and for a while this website, Neighborly, was helping to connect people to invest directly in municipal bonds. They have focused on other things now, but it'll just be a matter of time before another website comes around to help people do this. Number 6, you can invest in your favorite local business. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that in order to take money from grassroots investors, you have to spend some money on the legal process. And historically, the way that people did this is what they would call a direct public offering, a DPO. And an example of a DPO that was pretty successful is the Quimper Mercantile in Port Townsend, Washington. So Port Townsend is a town of about 10,000 people, about 2 hours north drive of Seattle, and they did not have a place where they could buy socks and underwear. And rather than inviting a Walmart to come in, they decided to build their own general store. And they raised almost $1 million to start the store by selling shares of the company like Girl Scout cookies door to door. The good people of Port Townsend stepped up, and this mercantile has been profitable every year since it was launched about 7-8 years ago. Now, it bothered me enormously that it still was so expensive for something like the Quimper Mercantile to raise money from grassroots investors. So I and a bunch of other people started pushing around 2009, 2010 for changes in securities laws. And what it all culminated in is a legalization of investment crowdfunding called the Jobs Act, which was signed by this guy, President Obama, in 2012. And by the way, I took this picture with my iPhone. It was the first and only time I've been in a Rose Garden ceremony. And the law was implemented in 2016. And now you can go to any one of about 30 federally licensed websites online. This one is called Wefunder. And you, as an unaccredited investor, can put up to $2,200 per year in locally owned businesses that rather inexpensively put their offering onto these websites. As of about a year ago, there was $340 million of transactions that have been raised. And depending upon, how you think about it, that's either a large amount of money, or compared to trying to shift $56 trillion, it's a tiny amount of money. But it's a little bit of progress. And some interesting things you should know about these crowdfunding issues. 60% of them that have been put online have been successful. The average raise is about $270,000. The average person is putting about $900 per offering into the company. And the most successful companies have been those companies that are owned by African Americans and women. In other words, the people most excluded from the existing capital markets have been those who have been the biggest beneficiaries of crowdfunding. Now, the last one of my magnificent 7 is local investment funds. And funds are in some ways a lot easier to put our money into than one-off things that we find out there, because presumably a fund manager has done the work for you of evaluating the companies, and then they will work with the companies, and they have a diversity in their portfolio, which means that if one company goes south, you don't lose everything. So there's about 24 local investment funds around the country that allow grassroots investors to participate. So this picture here is from a fund in Columbus, Ohio, called the Economic and Community Development Institute. Some colleagues and I recently wrote a handbook on community investment funds. And if anyone is interested, please email me. This is available for free, and I'm happy to share it with you. But in this community investment fund handbook, we basically talk about 4 criteria for a community investment fund: that they allow grassroots investors to participate, that they invest in locally owned businesses or projects, that they have local decision-making that involves the objects of those investments. So in other words, community members might be on the board making a decision about the investment. And we're not talking about charity. We're talking about funds that actually deliver to investors some kind of positive rate of return. So in this handbook, we talked about 10 interesting models of local investment funds. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but here's a running list, and you can see that they're all over the country: Boston, Oakland, Montana, Vermont. They focus on all kinds of different issues: racial equity, sustainability, organic farming, food systems, and they rely on various legal strategies to operate. Let me just give you a handful of examples. The Boston Impact Fund was founded in 2017, and it focuses on racial justice in several adjacent low-income neighborhoods in Boston. And they allow grassroots investors to participate. But one of the clever things they've done is that they've encouraged foundations and deep pocket investors to come in, to put in their money for a longer period, to have a lower rate of return, and that money is the highest risk money. So if anything goes under, the philanthropists cover those costs, which greatly enhances the confidence that all other investors will see some kind of positive rate of return here. And it's worth noting that you in the St. Louis area have a accelerator, WePower Accelerator, which is beginning to think about how to incorporate a fund like this in its operations. The second example is the Good Works Evergreen Fund in Montana. This fund was founded in 2019, and its mission is to invest in legacy businesses. I mean, there are millions of businesses across this country, and again, we're talking pre-COVID, where the founder wants to retire. There's not a natural chain of succession. And if that person just shuts down the business, the community loses something critical. So what GoodWorks Evergreen is trying to demonstrate is they can buy up businesses like this. They can retool the businesses, and they're starting with a business called Don's Hardware, and then they can spin off that business again as a locally owned self-financing entity. A third example is the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op, which basically combines the idea of a co-op, an investment fund, and a community land trust. And the whole idea is to make it easier for people in the Oakland area to buy into housing, to have cheaper housing and to keep the price of that housing affordable. And they have raised several $100,000 so far. They want to ultimately raise many millions of dollars, and they expect to be paying their investors a 1.5% dividend per year. Another kind of model is the Northeast Kingdom Fund in Vermont, the northeast corner of the state of Vermont. And this fund operates a little differently. It uses a technique that many charities use, which allows you to basically get a big investment from someone, and then you hold that money and you pay them income off that investment for their lifetime. And when they die, that corpus goes to the charity. And the advantage to the donor is that they get a big tax write-off. So this fund has $2 million in it right now, and it is focused on health, but health broadly defined, which includes good food and good family nurturing and education and good local businesses. The final example that I want to share is Pioneer Valley Grows from Western Massachusetts. This fund was set up in 2015. It put several $1 million into 35 local food businesses. None of their businesses have gone belly up yet. They have 70 investors now, but they want to grow this. This woman here runs a wonderful mushroom farm that's been the beneficiary of this fund. Now, I want to say that all 7 of these investment opportunities are problematic for us when it comes to putting our own money in, because most of us, if we have any money to invest, it is locked away in our pension funds. And it might be a 401k with our employer, or 403b if you're a nonprofit, or it might be something you set up yourself, an investment retirement account, IRA. How can you get your money out of these things? Well, there's 2 tools that I've written about in my most recent book, Put Your Money Where Your Life Is. And by the way, the book comes out next week. So this is a timely talk. One thing you can do is you can create a self-directed IRA where you can hire a custodian and you direct the custodian to put your money in any local investment things that you care about. You can even create your own limited liability company. So all the money coming in and out of this liability company is your investment portfolio. And the cost of doing this can be as low as about $250 per year. Another option is a solo 401k. And this is advantageous because a solo 401k you can create out of your own bank account. You administer this fund yourself, but you have to know the rules about what you can and can't invest in. And again, if you shop around, you can find a cost of a solo 401k for as cheap as about $300 per year. I actually think the solo 401k is the superior device because you have your own checkbook control. You don't have to monkey around with a custodian, and you're allowed to put a lot more money into that account each year. And there's one feature of a solo 401k that you don't have in a self-directed IRA, and that is you can give yourself a 5-year loan of up to 50% of your account or $50,000, whichever is the higher number. So that's pretty important because, for example, if you want to get yourself out of credit card debt, you could take money out of your solo 401k, pay off the 25% per year credit cards, and then pay yourself back at 3, 4, 5% per year. Get yourself out of debt, and all of the interest that you're paying to get yourself out of debt goes back into your savings, your retirement savings. In order to set up a solo 401k, you need 2 basic requirements. One is you have to earn at least $1 on your Schedule C as a self-employed person. So if you sell one object on eBay and report that on Schedule C, you can open up a solo 401k. The other thing is you can't have any full-time employees. And a full-time employee is someone who works more than 20 hours per week. But that's pretty easy because what we all can do is we could set up a solo 401k, and then when you are done with your current workplace, maybe you retire, maybe you're fired, maybe you change jobs, then you have the ability to roll over that 401k into your solo 401k. And then you are home free and investing in all 7 of the things we just talked about. If you're interested in these ideas about how to invest in yourself and in your community and your local businesses, I invite you to do 2 things. One is I set up with some colleagues a website about 1.5 years ago called The Next Egg, thenextegg.org, and we work with people to help them set up these self-directed IRAs and solo 401ks and work through all the complicated rules. And then the second thing is that I am just starting to put on for communities virtual workshops where we do a really deep dive in all of the rules about local investing, the securities laws, how do you find local investments, how do you evaluate them, how do you set up these do-it-yourself accounts, how do you administer them, what can you put your money in, what can't you, what would a personal plan look like? And if you start putting your plans together in a kind of post-COVID mobilization around local businesses, what would that look like? So I am going to stop there. Here's my calling card, and I will be happy to have the host of this webinar distribute my slides. And this email, shuman@igc.org, is where you can find me. And I am going to stop here and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Michael. Fabulous. I mean, I have a million questions for you. I'll just start with one and then I'll let everybody else kind of jump in. So I get this weird resistance from people when we start to talk about things like this. I guess specifically because we talk about how everything is related to, climate change, and we need to develop these new ways of doing business so that we're, protecting future generations. And a lot of people are real afraid of that for some reason, and they think it's going to infringe on their rights, and it's going to, we're trying to control everything, and I just wonder, how do we overcome that sort of that fear and that misconception?
Right. So I think most of that fear is rooted in a regulatory approach to reducing carbon. And I'm not saying that I'm against regulatory approaches, but I think that people who worry about their freedoms, whether it's their business freedom or their COVID freedom or whatever, what they're really saying is, I don't want the government telling me what I can't and can do. And one of the reasons, interestingly, we've been able to change securities laws is that we've built a really good coalition between freedom-loving conservatives and environment-loving locavores. And the two working together have been able to change a lot of securities regulations. And I believe that another approach to remaking our economy is to, and we have to do this, is to create a diversified local economy that meets more and more of our needs based on local resources and does so in a climate neutral or hopefully even a climate positive way. And one of the other projects that I'm working on now is called the Locopedia, where we are developing model small-scale business plans all across the world so that people can say, gee, how can I do small-scale chicken production in an environmentally friendly way in my community? And you would use the Locopedia and boom, you'd find 10 companies that are doing it and could provide models for you. To me, this is how ultimately we're going to solve the climate crisis without creating a lot of villains.
So we just have to trust people more and understand the problem more, maybe?
Well, nurture the kinds of businesses that we think the world should be made out of and demonstrate that they work. And that those demonstration projects, again, if shared broadly, I think will give communities everywhere a hopeful direction to move in.
Okay. Well, we've got some questions here in the chat. I don't know if have you got that open, or you want me to read them?
Why don't you read them? Because yeah, I haven't. I'll open the chat, but why don't you pick out the ones that interest you?
Okay. Well, here's one. It's do most towns, cities? Oops. I'm getting more added as we roll here. Do most towns, cities even have local banks anymore?
So, very good question. And over the last 25 years, there has been massive consolidation of big banks, medium banks, little banks. It used to be that every community had its own local bank or credit union. Now it's less likely. So it's an unfortunate thing, but it's not because it is uneconomic to do these things. It's because in many instances, the local banker just said, you know, it's just going to be easier for me to sell to the bigger banker and I'll retire, cash out, and live happily ever after. But I still think it is possible for a community to build its own local bank or credit union. I mean, credit union is easier and cheaper if it wants to. And so if your community is missing one, there are resources out there that can help you move in the right direction. But here's another thing that I would say is that banking is only a small part of the local investment picture. And this is something that people don't appreciate. I mentioned the number earlier, $56 trillion, that Americans have $56 trillion saved in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, pension funds, and insurance funds. The comparable number for all banks and credit unions is about $8 trillion. So in other words, if you perfectly localized all of your savings in local banks or credit unions, you would still have a massive problem of investment going in the wrong things. So most of our investment these days is how we do our pension investment, not how we do our banking.
Okay. Any recommendations for how to communicate the message that purchasing from local businesses is more valuable than purchasing from Amazon when Amazon makes it so easy and inexpensive?
Right. So there's a lot to say here. And the first point to make is that I doubt there is anyone that we know who makes a purchasing decision exclusively on price. And that's sort of a shocking statement because anyone who's taken Economics 101 and has seen all the graphs you draw with price on one axis and quantity on the other, price is what it's all about, isn't it? But the truth is that if we made our decisions only on price, Starbucks coffee would never exist because it's the most expensive cup of coffee that you can find. What people make their purchasing decisions is the concept of value. What is the best price and the best quality and the most reliable merchant and all of the other things that I'm looking for in a purchase. And the truth is that Walmart, Walmart's true too, but for Amazon, you may get something that's really good on price, but you may not get the other features that you necessarily are looking for. You don't have the ability necessarily to inspect things, and some people also just really enjoy shopping, and some people like the social part of going to, say, a farmer's market and being deprived in that is a cost. And some people appreciate that local businesses are good for their economy, and that's part of the package as well. So here's what I recommend to people, which is that, I mean, no one should buy local all of the time, irrespective of price. But when you confront a purchasing decision, ask yourself, what are the real local alternatives? For example, I had some parts of a Weber grill that wore out about 2 weeks ago. There were two ways we could do this. One way was to order through Amazon or the Weber people online directly. The other way was to go to our local hardware store and have them do the order for us. And we decided to do that because we care about that local hardware store. Now, I want to speak to the COVID moment because clearly we are in a situation right now where millions, I mean, and that is not an exaggeration, millions of local businesses are in danger of going bankrupt. And I think we're not going to be able to save all of them, but I think all of us should figure out a handful of local businesses we really care about, we really think are essential for our community, and support them in various ways. And one way you can support them, I call this in my blog adopting a local business. And by adoption, I mean you figure out what were you going to spend at this place over the next year, and you give them a check for that amount right now, if you can afford to do that. So I have a favorite restaurant, local restaurant called Busboys and Poets here. My partner and I wrote them $1,000 check, and they gave us $1,200 in gift cards for us to use over the next year. And the advantage of that is that Busboys and Poets now has $1,000 of cash to help it through this really difficult period and keep people on payroll and keep the restaurant alive. And I think, all of us are being called upon to do this. And once the COVID crisis passes, we should start thinking about local investment as another way of keeping these businesses alive. Many businesses are completely unaware of these local investment options, and that's why it's so important for us to educate them.
Right. So think before you buy or invest. Think about the actual value that you're getting. Okay, we've got a question here. How do you approach town governments to create an economic development strategy based on local business instead of chain stores and franchises?
Yeah, so this is really the heart of what I've been trying to do for the last 20 years. And I'll say the book, Amy, that you read, The Local Economy Solution, is really a long version of an argument to an economic development department to stop doing attraction of outside businesses and start focusing laser-like on the nurturing of local businesses. And there's so many reasons to do it. First of all of the evidence shows that local economic development works and attraction economic development is a complete flop. But if you look at it even on the price per job, you know, for those communities that succeed, the small number of communities that succeed in attracting an auto plant or an Amazon or some other outside business, typically the cost is several $100,000 per job. The cost of creating a local business, I have found when I really ask this question in some kind of methodical way with local economic developers, is somewhere around $500 to $1,000 per job. So it is not only dumb to do business attraction, it's expensive, and no one has money to waste. So I think it's pretty critical that local governments dump the waste of money in outside attraction and really focus their more limited resources now on the nurturing and expansion of those remaining local businesses post-COVID. Another thing that I would say is that local governments can do some really inexpensive and logical things to support local businesses. For example, you could create a tab on the local government website where you just list all of the businesses in your community that are looking for money for investment. And that way it answers the question instantaneously of anyone who wishes to be a local investor in the community. Who's looking for money? Another thing that the local government can do is increase the incentives for bidders, local business bidders, to come in for procurement contracts. And I've been recommending that local governments actually ask any bidder that comes in for a government contract to represent what percentage of the contract will you spend on locally owned businesses, because that will give you a sense of how much tax money your jurisdiction is going to collect. And you should adjust every bid by the expected taxes. And if you do that, you will be localizing your procurement and tremendously boosting your economic development future, all while reducing the overall cost to local government of getting bids.
Okay, thank you. We're going to try to stay on schedule here, but I want to get to one more question here from our attendee, Caitlin LePage. Jumping back to the notion of price and value, I would think price would play a greater role in buying decisions in less affluent communities. Do you see it being more challenging to grow and invest in small businesses in these communities who arguably would benefit from it more?
You know, it's. I think that it's interesting that people with limited income or limited wealth are actually more demanding and more careful in determining value in their decisions. And so I would not say that people with limited wealth or limited income want to throw away their money on non-local businesses. I think they actually are often the ones who see tremendous value in, say, local food. And we've seen that, by the way, in the last 10 years or so, as the U.S. Department of Agriculture and various state analogs have created these double up food bucks that basically say to people, we're going to double the value of your SNAP benefits when you use them at farmers markets. And if it were true that people with limited income were not attentive to value and healthy food, this program would have been a flop. But in fact, it has expanded to over $100 million, and every community wants in on it because they see the demand.
Right. Okay. Michael, thank you. We have more questions, but we're going to move on to our next part of our program.
And I'll stick around for the remaining discussion.
Right. And you'll be on our panel, so we'll hopefully be able to pick your brain a little bit more here today. I am going to just stop recording here real quick.